Kane was 2 pounds and 15 ounces. Grace was 3 pounds and 10 ounces. Obviously at first I didn't have any milk. Once it started coming in really quickly. My whole freezer door was full of milk. When they hit 19 months in February, I decided that was the end. I decided to sit down for this one because it's a long one. Breastfeeding twins is not easy, so it took a while to get to where we got. I'm just gonna start from the very beginning. They were born at 32 weeks. Kane was 2 pounds and 15 ounces and Grace was 3 pounds and 10 ounces. Pretty tiny. When they were born, they were taken straight to the NICU where they were connected to all these wires and a feeding tube, and that's pretty much how they were fed for the first 2 weeks of their life. Because I couldn't give them bottles or start breastfeeding until they were 34 weeks by per hospital protocol, I started pumping to be able to start getting my milk supply going and be able to at least feed them my breast milk through the feeding tubes that they were connected to. When I first started pumping, I believe, if my memory serves me right, I actually started pumping before I even got to meet them. I just kind of like got a glance at their head when they were born. They were born via C-section, so I didn't really get to touch them or really see them very clearly. So only 12 hours later, I was able to see them, but I was given a pump pretty much as soon as I woke up from surgery, and I started pumping. Obviously at first I didn't have any milk besides a little bit of colostrum, and by a little bit I mean like 2 drops. Like I mean it's my first time, so I don't know what I expected, but I was just shocked. I was like, what? Like I don't have milk. Like I was starting to stress out a bit, but apparently colostrum is actually really good and really healthy, and it really fills up the tummy those first, you know, few days until you get your actual milk in. And so because Kane was almost a pound smaller than Grace, all of that colostrum that I would pump would be given to him just because he needed it more. And then Grace was given donor milk. I am a big advocate for breastfeeding, which is why I chose to go with the donor breast milk over formula. I know some people feel a little bit weird about that because it's not yours, it comes from somebody else's body, but honestly, it's breast milk. Like that's the best nutrition you can give your baby. And this is not to say formula is bad. Like if this is your choice, then that's you. This was just my journey and my personal choice for my babies. So they finally turned 34 weeks, right? The last 2 weeks, they've only been fed by the tube feeding. I have been pumping religiously every 2.5 hours pretty much. It was like every 3 hours, but at the 3 hour mark, I'd start pumping. It would take 30 minutes to pump, and then by the time you watch the parts, you go to sleep for 2 hours, and then you wake up again in half an hour. So technically every 2.5 hours from the end of a pump to a start of a pump. And after 2 weeks of that, my milk started coming in at about day 3. I finally got like an ounce, and I was like so excited. It was like in the morning, all night, it was still nothing, but a little bit more drops every single pump. And then one morning I pump and it's like an ounce, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And then the next pump, like I kid you not, the next pump, it's like 1.5 ounces. And then the next pump, it's like 2 ounces. So once it started coming in, really quickly. But I was finally given permission to start feeding them at 34 weeks. And it's so weird to even think about that I had to wait for permission, but it is what it is. I'm grateful for the NICU and everything they did, and I'm sure there's a reason for that. I told the nurses right away that I wanted to breastfeed. They were totally on board, and we started trying. The first feeding with Grace was a complete disaster. We tried to get her to latch, and she like kind of latched, but wouldn't like be able to get any milk out. And so after a couple attempts, we just kind of gave up and just gave her bottle through the feeding tube. But with Kane, it was different. Like I put him on and he latched instantly. Like he had the whole suck, swallow, breathe thing from the very beginning, which was amazing. Everybody was really shocked for a 34-week preemie who was born barely 3 pounds to be able to latch that quickly and do so good. Like nobody expected it. So I tried breastfeeding for a week straight. All of the day feeds I would do because I was sleeping at home at night, so I would pump while my husband was taking night shift and staying there for the night. And then during the day, I would stay there all day while he went to work. So during the day feeds, I tried feeding them every single feed, but it was just not going well. They were not latching properly. On day 3, we introduced the nipple shield, and that kind of helped, but not really, honestly. They were only taking in like 1 milliliter for, like, the best was like 15, and that was like really good because that was like half of their feed. They were barely taking anything. I was getting really frustrated, and their feedings were the only thing that was keeping us in the NICU at this point because they were able to regulate their own temperature. They were breathing on their own. So after about a week and a half of breastfeeding, now my husband and I decided to just stop and switch to bottles because it didn't really seem like the breastfeeding is going anywhere. We're just staying at the NICU literally for feedings at this point, and maybe bottles will just work out better. Maybe they're just too small, which they were really tiny, like their mouth would barely like latch. So we decided to just switch to bottles, and then once we get home, we can try to work on breastfeeding at home. I wasn't giving up on breastfeeding though. I would still try to breastfeed them during the day whenever I could, at least one feeding. And then nighttime was all bottles, just because I heard about the nipple confusion thing, and I didn't want them to like completely refuse breastfeeding in the future. But that was really not going anywhere. After about 3 days of that, I was like, okay, like we're just gonna go full on bottles day and night. Now, after we made the switch to bottles all the time, we noticed something really weird going on. And I'm not gonna accuse anybody of anything, but it just kind of seemed like anytime we were not there at the NICU, like if we were to go out for dinner and like not be there for the 8 p.m. feed, the nurses would be in charge of that. And it also depended on the nurse too. It wasn't all of them. It just seemed like every time we weren't there, the twins did not eat very well by mouth out of the bottles. But when we were there, they were eating at least 60% of their feedings, like up to like 100%, like practically the whole bottle they were finishing with us. But when the nurses were there, that wasn't happening, and it just kind of got a little bit frustrating because it seemed like they weren't even trying. A few times we'd go out for lunch or dinner, let's say, and we'd come back and they didn't even eat anything out of a bottle. The nurse didn't even try. They just plug in the feeding tubes and call it good. And then they would just kind of say, oh, they're tired from last feed. And it's like, okay, like I get it, but can we at least try? You know, like they're clearly awake for feeding, they're hungry, they're gonna eat if they're hungry. Anyways, it was just a little bit frustrating. It got a little bit too personal at this point. Me and my husband were kind of pissed. So this is when my husband and I decided that from now on, we are gonna be there for every single feed. We are both spending the night at the NICU. Don't ask us where we slept. He slept on the bench and I slept on the reclining chair, and we would kind of switch off. One night he sleeps on the bench, one night I sleep on the bench, and then he'll sleep on the reclining chair. This way we knew for sure we are not missing any feeds, because sometimes he would just fall asleep and completely not even hear the nurse come in for a feed, and she would just connect the feeding tubes and leave, and then he would be woken up by the beeping machine after the feed is done, and then the nurse comes in and just turns it off, and he was like, what? Like, you already fed them? Like, why didn't you wake me up? With both of us being there, I had to wake up every 2 hours, 2.5 hours to pump anyways, so I would set an alarm 30 minutes before the twins had to wake up for their feed. I would pump, and that way I was already kind of awake for their feed. So after I pumped, we would just give them that milk, and I would be there feeding them. This was very, very exhausting though, because not only am I pumping for 30 minutes, I'm also feeding each one for 30 minutes. So I was running on like 1 hour of sleep pretty much between every single feed, because they took forever to eat at this point. They would take 30 minutes to finish a bottle with like literally 1 ounce of milk, and you would have to hold them like a certain way so that they don't like choke on the milk and like take little breaks. It was a lot, and I was really exhausted. But luckily this didn't last too long, because within 3 days we finally got the green light to go home, because they were eating more than 80% of their feedings at this point already. And on the 4th day, we were finally released out of the NICU. This is not the 4th day of the NICU. This is 34 days 34 days we were at the NICU. So yeah, after 3 days and nights of me feeding them, they were somehow finishing all of their bottles versus when the nurses were feeding them. So I don't know, maybe they just felt my presence and so they just ate better with me. I don't know what the deal is. I could just think up of scenarios, but that's what happened. Once we got home, I needed to reset and rest because those last couple days were just rough. So I didn't even attempt breastfeeding. We just stuck to bottles for a couple days. I would just pump, give them bottles, and then literally sleep between every single feed. Like, I felt like I was sleeping the entire time, all day and all night, and I was still exhausted. Like, it felt like I'm not getting any sleep, but I'm also sleeping all day and all night. Whew, it was exhausting. But I also went through a pretty major surgery, so I feel like my body was just going through a lot and I just really needed to rest, and that was really hard, being able to rest, but also knowing that 2 humans depend on you, so you have to be up every 2 hours to feed them. I think it was like day 3 when I finally started to try to breastfeed them again, and let me tell you, it did not go well. It did not go well. When I tell you, I never knew 5-pounders, 5-pound babies can have so much strength and attitude. I was shocked. I was on the verge of tears. As I'm trying to put them on the breast and get them to latch, they are screaming their lungs off. They are literally pushing against me with their hands, screaming. And at this point, I don't know what to think. Like, I feel like I didn't really get that bonding with them from the very beginning, like most moms I hear get. And so like, this was really important to me to like actually breastfeed and like bond with them in that way. And seeing them pushing away and screaming, it was emotionally very hard. My dreams of breastfeeding were being crushed, but I am not a quitter and I did not give up. I kept trying. Every day for 1 feed, I tried to put them on the breast and get them to latch. Obviously they would refuse a lot, so I would back off. But there were times where randomly they actually would latch and nurse. I noticed that those times were more common right after a feed. So after I gave them a bottle and they kind of seemed like they were still kind of uneasy and like still looking for something, I would put them on the breast and they would actually latch. And I feel like it's maybe because they weren't like starving. And breastfeeding is complicated for babies. They have to learn how to do that, and babies are lazy. So after I give them that bottle feed, if they were still hungry, I would kind of supplement it, nursing, and they took it. And those moments like melted my heart and gave me hope. And I'm like, okay, I think we'll get there. Like if they're doing this, I just need to figure out when they're more likely to eat and just do that more often until they learn how to do it, and we won't have a problem then. Of course, their latch was horrible, like horrible, to the point where after one of those nursing sessions, I could not. I legit had to take the next 2 days off because it hurt so bad. So bad. But their mouths were so tiny. I mean, I'm not surprised they couldn't get a good latch, but we needed to practice, so I kept trying and trying and trying. So I figured out that once they had their milk through bottle, they were more likely to breastfeed, so I started doing that more often. And then after I would breastfeed them, I would pump afterwards, and kind of based on how much I would pump, assume how much they actually took from breast, that feeding. And this was like triple the work because I am pumping to feed them. And then after I feed them through the bottle, I have to feed them again through nursing. And then I have to pump again after to see how much they actually took. And then yeah, and then about an hour later, I have to pump again for their bottle feed. So it was not fun. Once they got comfortable with latching after bottle feeds, I started replacing 1 bottle feed a day with just nursing. And that worked out fine. Obviously, they weren't taking as much from nursing as through the bottle because I would still pump afterwards and kind of see. Doing this whole bottle nursing pumping kind of gave me an idea how much they were eating, and also an idea of when to expect them to be hungry again next time. I fed them every 3 hours because that's kind of how we got our schedule set up at the NICU. So if they ate less than what they usually eat in a bottle, I would expect them to get hungry within 2 hours the next time, so I'd feed them a little bit earlier. Then I slowly moved up to doing 2 feeds a day of just nursing, no bottles, and this was getting pretty exhausting because then I moved up to 3, or I was trying to move up to 3, but it was just exhausting because I still have to wake up and pump, I have to breastfeed, I still have to pump afterwards, and then washing all the bottles, and it was just so much. Like, it was just constant feeding, pumping, washing, like it was just a lot. Like a lot. So when they were about 4 months, my husband needed to take a work trip to Florida, and he was leaving for about 8 days, I believe. I decided this is the perfect time to really like dive in and start breastfeeding them like all the time, like replace all bottle feeds. And so I started doing that while my husband was gone. They did start eating a lot more often because they weren't taking as much through breast as they were with bottles, and I knew that because I was still pumping after every feeding, just to know. So I knew that they weren't eating as much, and so I was feeding every hour at this point. By the end of day 2 of doing this, they were screaming nonstop. I just gave them a bath. They had regular naps throughout the day. They're dry, they just had a bath. Like, I did not know what was going on. They were just screaming and screaming and screaming, and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna give them a bottle because that's literally the only explanation right now. And so I gave them bottles and they just passed out. Right after the bottle, they fell asleep and slept for 3 hours straight. I think they were just not getting enough, although they were eating very often, every hour or so. They were just not getting as much as they were through bottle. So going forward, I decided I'm not gonna torture myself or them. So especially nighttime, waking up every hour is exhausting, and I literally just put the 2 Snuggle Me loungers on my bed, put them in there, and slept like in between them, so I was able to feed them throughout the night without like getting up. So kind of co-sleeping with them while my husband was gone. So after 2 days of that, I decided I'm done. Going forward, only breastfeeding on demand during the day, but I'm pumping and giving them bottles during the night. And we had this routine going for the following 5 months. It worked really well for us. They were about 10 months when I stopped pumping whatsoever, and I started breastfeeding Kane only at nights because he was just a better latcher and overall drank more milk. And so I would breastfeed him at night and give her a bottle because I had a pretty large freezer stash of milk from when they were in the NICU, and throughout pumping I was producing a little bit more than they needed, so I was able to freeze a ton of milk. Like, my whole freezer door was full of milk, and then I have a mini like fridge, and the freezer on top of it was full to the top with breast milk too. So I was giving her bottles of milk, and then I was breastfeeding him at night. And we had this going for a couple months until I started running out of milk. During the day, I'd still only breastfeed both of them, so I wasn't using my stash during the day, it was only during the night. But I was also not making enough for both of them at this point to just have breast milk, which was fine because they did start on solids already. They were 10 months, and I started them on like purees and stuff at 7 months, maybe even like 6.5 months, like pretty early for them because they were preemies. I was just worried about my milk supply, so I'm like, I'm gonna start introducing the purees a little bit so they get some nutrition from actual food and then supplement with milk. But after 10 months, I kind of started getting worried because they were only eating purees. They were still heavily dependent on breastfeeding, and my milk supply was taking a dive, and I was starting to get worried. So I went and picked up some formula. And mind you, this is during a formula shortage. So I was freaking out. I have 2 babies to feed. I am not making enough milk. They're not taking in enough solids yet. And I just kind of got scared. And I feel like from the stress, that was not helping my milk supply either. So I went and got formula, and I tried giving it to them, and they refused it. They were gagging, they were coughing, they did not like it whatsoever. I knew I had to keep going for another 2 months at least until they were 1, until I can give them cow's milk, because formula was just not doing it for them. Luckily, I had a friend who had a baby 2 months after me, and she had a little bit of milk in her freezer stash, and so she gave me that. So I was able to continue feeding Grace nighttime with a bottle while breastfeeding Kane. So I am so grateful for that. Luckily, as they got closer to 1, they got better and better at taking solids throughout the day. So I was having just enough milk to supplement what they weren't getting in solids. So when they turned 1, I attempted giving them cow milk, and the reaction was the same as to formula. They gagged, they did not want it, they spit it out. I was like, okay, well, I can't stop now. I mean, I can, but they're not taking enough solids to just stop milk completely, and they do not want cow's milk. So I continued nursing. Like, that was the only option for me. They were still pretty tiny. They were not gaining weight as quickly as other babies around us. So after 1, the next couple months, I just breastfed. And I would give Grace the freezer stash that I still had, and then once I ran out of the freezer stash, I started giving them cow's milk again. So this was like maybe 3 months after they turned 1, and surprisingly, to my surprise, they actually took it. So I kind of took that as my chance to fully stop nursing at night. So I stopped nursing at night. Actually, I think I kind of slowly went out of it. So I would nurse just 1 time at night and then give milk, like cow's milk, the rest of the times. And then eventually I completely stopped nursing at night and just gave them cow's milk. I probably nursed at night up until about 15 months, 16 months probably. And then after 16 months, I stopped nursing at night and would only nurse during the day. So nighttime, they would get cow's milk. Daytime, they would get breast milk. We continued this cycle for the next 3 months, because if I started at 16 months, I weaned them by 19 months. At 18 months, so 2 months of this, they were eating very well at this point. You know, 18 months, they're 1.5 years. Most of their diet comes from solids. They're taking cow's milk at this point at nighttime. So if I would give them cow milk during the day for like right before a nap, they would take it. And I did start doing that. So right before a nap, I would give them cow's milk just so they could have a longer nap, because they're terrible nappers. Like, ever since they were newborns, they would take only like 20-30 minute naps, and then it got up to like 40 minutes, and that's like max. That's it. If they took an hour nap, that was like, what is going on? What happened? And it would only be 1 baby too, so it doesn't even matter. One of them would still wake up at like 40 minutes. So at 18 months, my husband was kind of the one that like pushed me to finally make that decision. I kind of felt like I was ready, because they would wake up at night, even though they would get their bottles, and use me as a pacifier. And that started getting a little bit painful. So I was like kind of over it, because I was really sore, and I'm like, this shouldn't be this hard at this age. Like, I thought that was kind of like more of like a newborn thing. So I was like, okay, I'm kind of ready because this is kind of painful, but I'm also not ready because I love this bond that we have. Like, they don't have that with anybody else. And it was hard, but I feel like I was like, okay, I'm ready. Like, I was shocked I even made it to a year. My goal was 6 months, but then I made it to a year, and then now I'm at 18 months, and I'm like, wow, like, I did really good. I am really surprised with how far we've actually come, and I think this is a good time to start weaning. So I started the weaning process. I would take away 1 feed a day and replace it with a bottle with like water or some juice or milk, cow's milk mainly. So I started replacing 1 feed a day for like the first week, and then the second week I would replace another feed, and then the next week, 3rd week, I would only let them do 1 feed per day. And so when they would ask for it, I kept like redirecting their attention to a bottle, which they love bottles. They never had a problem taking the bottle after breastfeeding. They loved it. And so I got lucky with that, because I know a lot of kids refuse the bottle after breastfeeding. So I would just redirect them with a bottle, and they were completely fine. My son did have a bigger attachment to me than my daughter. She was honestly ready to wean. She was a natural when it came to weaning. If I weren't to offer it, she wouldn't even ask. If she didn't see Kane coming to me and nursing, she wouldn't even ask. Anytime she saw him nursing, she would want to nurse. But if he weren't to nurse, she wouldn't. And when it came to the last week of the month, when I was like refusing the feeds, I would only nurse maybe like every 2 days, every 3 days that last week. And I never really knew when the last time was, but when they hit 19 months in February, I decided that was the end. Like starting February, we had not a single breastfeeding feed. That was the end. It was all of January that we were weaning. He did have a really hard time. He did cry and throw a couple of tantrums. My husband had to take over sometimes and like get his attention off of me, and I would like leave and go do something else. And it was rough with him, but it wasn't bad to the point where we were losing our minds and he was turning blue and purple and like going crazy. Last week, like I said, he was still trying to nurse. So I would give in every 2-3 days, but those last 2 feeds, she would see him nursing and I would be like, do you want to nurse too? Like actually ask her. And she was like, no. Like she didn't want to. She would just turn around and go play. Like she didn't even want to. She was ready. He wasn't really ready, but I think some kids just like are never really ready. Like you just kind of have to cut it off. So yeah, that was kind of where our breastfeeding journey ended. Luckily, thank God, I never had mastitis or any infection. I never had an issue with engorgement or anything after I stopped. I felt like we slowly started breastfeeding less and less and less naturally as they got older. It was more for comfort, especially since I wasn't breastfeeding at night anymore, only during the day, and then I was barely even having any milk. Like I could feel like I don't have much there. It was more for comfort, so I didn't have a ton of milk to like cause any kind of infection or problems. Now when I started pumping, when I first had them, I did have like engorged breasts. Like I had like knots in them, and I kid you not, when it happened the first time, I think it was like the second week, we were at a friend's house for dinner, and I just pumped. Like I just went to the bathroom and pumped, and I like come out and I feel like this pain on the side, and I like touch it and it's like a lump. Oh my goodness, I freaked out. I did not know what it is. I'm like Googling things and it's like cancer, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I did not know what to think. But then I did more research and started like massaging it. I ended up getting it out, but it was so painful, and I ended up getting like a few of those afterwards too. And I was pumping so often, like so often. I don't know how they kept coming back like every couple weeks, but I think the last one I had was in October, so it was 3 months after I had them was the last time I had one of those. And after that, none since. It takes about 3 to 4 months for your body to regulate your breast milk production, so I feel like it kind of regulated at that point, and so it kind of stopped happening afterwards. But yeah, that's kind of a breastfeeding journey, and it is breastfeeding awareness week this week that I'm recording this, so I thought it was just the perfect time to actually record this video and share my story, because I've been promising this for months and months. You guys have been asking me, and I just keep pushing it off because it is such a long topic and you could really go on and on and on and on about it. If you made it to the end, thank you so much. This was a lot, and I really hope that whoever's watching this, if you're going through this similar experience at whatever stage you are, don't give up. I did not give up. I kept pushing, even though I was literally like in tears those first couple weeks actually, that they just kept refusing and screaming and pushing me away, and I just felt defeated. Honestly, I felt like this was never gonna work, but I kept going for it, and even though it was really painful, by the time they learned to get that latch, we actually did it, and 18 months later we were still breastfeeding. So you can do this, you will do this, and thank you so much for being here, for watching, for supporting us. I hope you guys have a great day. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if it was helpful. Ask any more questions below if you want me to answer anything else that I might have missed, and I'll see you guys in my next video.